Thank you. I'd like to convene the council meeting of the Rules and City Government Committee. Please note for the record, Alderman Arnett and Alderman Savage are in attendance, and we're joined by Alderman Payon. The first item on our agenda is approval of the corrected minutes from the December 9th meeting. Ms. Green, your hand's up.
I'll move approval of the agenda.
Second.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just jumped right into. Okay, thank you. Move approval of the agenda. It was moved and properly seconded. All in favor of approving the agenda as written?
Aye.
Please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Okay, now approval of the minutes as amended.
Madam Chair, I'll move approval of both sets of the minutes, but I looked at the corrected ones and I couldn't tell what was corrected.
Ms. Green, could you speak to that? I know there were a couple of probably more editorial items
That's exactly what it was. Corrected. It was more editorial than anything else.
Well, okay. I read them, so the edits went down well. I move approval.
Second.
Okay. Please note that our minutes are legal documents. So if there are errors, they need to be corrected.
Sure.
And thus approved a second time, which is what we're doing here. So it's been moved and seconded that we approve the corrected minutes for the December 9th meeting and the minutes from the January 5/21 meeting. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Okay. First item on the agenda is 1919, adequate facilities, auto transportation facilities. For the purpose of clarifying the circumstances that would require a traffic impact analysis for a proposed project, clarifying the standards to be used to determine adequacy, and generally relating to the adequacy of auto transportation facilities. And Ross and Alderman Savage and Alderman Arnett, are you? Oh no, Alderman Arnett, this is your legislation. So do you want to? You've sent us any number of documents, and you know, I have to say, it becomes very confusing for me, and I assume the public who's trying to keep up with this. And maybe it behooves the law department to spend a little bit more time with our legislation so that a sponsor doesn't have to amend his or her legislation, and, you know, extensively like we're seeing. I just feel like we're not prepared. So anyway, Alderman Arnett, I'm looking at the copy that has the red lines, the red text. And I assume that is all, is it 14 of your amendments?
You should have 4 things from me. In one email, you should have the clean version of the second reader.
Ross, sorry, Alderman, if I could interrupt real quickly, because I think Legistar is updated. So if we want to make sure we're operating on the same documents, we could, and the public can reference those documents that are posted.
So the first document you should have is the clean version of 1919 that was introduced on second reader on June 22nd, 2020. It has no red lines in it, so it is what the revised version of the ordinance is. That would be the version that you would look at to translate from page and line numbers for the amendments. And the red line document you don't really need to necessarily look at, except it would probably help you understand how the amendments would fit into what the second reader document would look like after amendments. You know, I wonder, so Ellie and Fred and Dewan are on, and they probably don't have any of this stuff.
No.
Alderman, let me make a statement. I would prefer for this committee that we look at the document that has the red lines on it, the red text.
Okay.
Because, and I'll tell you why, the red text shows how you've incorporated the changes.
Right.
Okay. So,
Madam Chair, could I ask an indulgence? Could Takia send to Fred and Ellie and Dewan the email that has these 3 attachments to it, and then they'll have the red line version as well?
And Ross, just so everybody knows, it's the last document listed in Legistar that's attached to this ordinance. It's called O-1919 as amended on second reading, 6/22/20 with amendments. It's a confusing name, but it's amendments in red line dated 2/1/21.
Oh, so that is the one
that's
okay.
The red line with our amendments. If that's what you wanted to start with, Madam Chair.
yes.
I'm looking at it right now.
Okay.
And it's attached in Granicus, I believe, because I printed it out from there.
Okay. All right. So,
Alderman Gay, you have a question about that?
So I have this. I'm just making the committee aware that the Public Safety Committee voted this down yesterday at the recommendation of the Transportation Committee. And so I just wanted to make that clear. And so part of this is just trying to get understanding, for me at least, what is going on now with this.
right.
Okay, well, before we talk about the committee recommendations, and I think we should hear those, let's give Alderman Arnett, if we're first of all on the same page with the document that is labeled amended on second reader 6/22/20. And that has the red lines in it. So we all have that copy?
And make sure it says at the end, red line 2/1/21, just so people are on the same document.
So,
and that has,
just like Rob said.
can we, I can't, one at a time. Alderman Savage, what are you saying?
so I just want to make sure people have the right one because the names overlap, and just the correct one is the O-19 as amended on second reading. And at the end of that name, it says red line 2/1/21. And those have the most recent amendments, which have not gone to the other committees yet because Ross and I were working on them last weekend, actually.
Then I don't have it because the one that I have simply says amended on second reader on 6/22, and it does have the red lines. So you're saying there's another version?
It's the same thing, I believe.
I'm seeing the speaker saying no. I mean, the sponsor saying no. So I'm going to defer to the sponsor. Tell me.
Ross, the one there, she's referring, well, actually, sorry, Madam Chair, yours does have red text in it?
Yes.
You said? Okay,
so
maybe it is the right one, but we can, I guess an easy way to check is when you go on the first page on title, the last
Rob,
line.
May we ask the sponsor to take us to where we should be, please? I know you know where you're going. I want the sponsor because we need to be on the same page, okay? So Ross, please tell us what we should be looking at.
If you're looking at a document which on page 1 on line 43 has adequate in caps and red, you're looking at the right document. And just to check, if you go to page 2, you should also have, starting on line 5, red all in caps for the purposes of this code and so forth. So anyone who has that version has the all of the amendments that I'm proposing, which are my amendments, Rob's amendments, amendments from Eastport Civic Association, amendments from the the task force, the Forest Drive Eastport Task Force Group. I mean, they're from all over the place.
Alderman, the second page you pointed, and I don't see what you're talking about, what read on the second page. I think I'm on the right document, but I just want to make sure.
On page, I appreciate that. On page 2, line 5, after auto transportation facilities, you should have a sentence in red, in caps, that says, for the purposes of this code, auto transportation refers to all vehicular traffic on roadways within the city of Annapolis. Don't have that, then we're in trouble.
Okay, the page numbers are different. I do have that, but it's on the bottom, for my copy, it's on the bottom of page 1.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
so, okay, but we're good. We're
Yes.
in the place. Okay.
All right, so which one are we using final?
It is the same one that's labeled second reading 6/22/20, and it's the one with the red lines.
Okay, perfect.
It says at the top in red with amendments 1 through 14.
It does not say it in red.
Okay.
So just leave
All right.
it alone, okay?
All I can say is that Jacqueline Lee is really on top of it, because I just sent this to her and she's already got it up in iLegislate. So I want to thank her for that. If, Madam Chair, if you wouldn't, oh, I'm sorry, Dawn has his hand up.
I don't have that one at all. None of the ones I have say amendments 1 through 14 at the top. In red.
It doesn't
Red or
say
black.
that. It
Oh,
does
you
not.
said it doesn't. Okay, cool.
It
cool.
does in Legistar.
Yeah, there's this parallel world we have. Yeah.
Okay, then I'm going to postpone action on this
Good.
because I printed out everything that I had before, and now I don't have what you have.
And I don't have
You
it
know,
either.
this is a problem.
It is a problem, and I don't have that. I'm not sure I have the version you have either.
Well, Ross, we could just go through based on the original ordinance as amended and just go through the amendments that way.
Or you could, excuse me, or you could go through the document that we all have.
Yes.
I know that's a novel idea,
I know.
but we do have a document I think that everybody has. Okay, it may not be the one in Legislar, but this is the one we all have. So why wouldn't we use this one? Alderwoman Tierney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to explain. We did not take action on it at the transportation. We postponed action at the Transportation Committee because the status of the ordinance at that point was that the Planning Commission looked at it and had extensive comments. Subsequent or concurrent with our committee meeting, Jacqueline Lee went through the Planning Committee's comments and made an amendment out of them. And I believe, unless I am mistaken, that is what this new document is. So it makes it current with the Planning Commission's extensive comments. Is
You
that
are mistaken.
Okay,
I am, okay. We need an explanation.
I am going to ask, as I asked Alderman Gay, to hold the committee reports until after Alderman Arnett has an opportunity to talk about his amendments. So please, let's just do that. So,
Right. So if you will indulge me, Madam Chair, I sent you and Rob a brief history, which is 2 pages long, that I think speaks to some of the confusion that's going on. So back in 2006, Alderman Cordell and I introduced the legislation for traffic impact analysis to be added to Title 22. That stood for 10 years. In 2016, Alderman Lippman and Pfeiffer, along with Mayor Panelides, submitted a small set of changes that had to do with the number of trips that would generate, reducing the number of new trips that would generate a traffic impact study. That is what I intended to do in introducing 01919. And I also wanted to expand the distance where troubled intersections would cause a traffic impact. However, the confusion began when Teresa Sutherland decided to rewrite all of the council legislation, and she did a rewrite of 01919, which took a long time, but which I did accept. And that rewrite is what was introduced as on second reader as a revised version of 01919. Meantime, the Forest Drive Eastport sector study decided to analyze 01919 as reintroduced on second reader and had a number of comments. And then the Office of Law intervened at the Planning Commission, and this is where I think you have it wrong, Ellie, and introduced this notion of taking a lot of stuff out of code and putting it into rules and regulations. And the Planning Commission took it upon themselves to rewrite the entire ordinance and submit it with that thought in mind, which I do not accept. It is my legislation. I do not accept the Planning Commission rewrite. I don't accept the Planning Commission rewrite of the small cell towers either. And I think we need to ask the Planning Commission to give us comments and not rewrite our legislation. So what you have before you today, after almost 2 years of twists and turns, is the legislation with the 14 amendments that I have collected from other colleagues and from other sources that I would like to propose to amend 01919 as submitted on second reader. The very first one is on what I have in front of me is line 43 of page 1. Does everyone have a line 43 of page 1 that says chapter 2221, review criteria for certification?
Yes.
And inserted there is for adequate automotive transportation facilities. And of course, the reason that I wanted to insert that is we want to certify adequate facilities. So I would move that as amendment number 1.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, further discussion?
Rob, just
Hearing none. I'm sorry, Alderman Gay?
Yeah, please cut me off if this is not the appropriate time to ask this question. But I think that to the point that Ross is making with this, the legislation and what I discussed with planning earlier today is that I think the missing piece to me is Rick Gordon or Director Gordon and the Department of Transportation, because the purpose of this legislation is that as we develop is to cut back on the amount of vehicles that are actually on the roads. And I think that as we develop, we should be considering mass transit and public transportation in general to help with that cutback. And so I think that it may be premature to put a number on the amount of vehicles per trips in a development when a key piece of that is public transportation. But we haven't looked at public transportation.
may I speak to that, Madam Chair?
Alderman Gay, you were speaking to the broader issue.
Yeah.
Right now on the floor is this one amendment, which adds the word adequate to whatever the law.
My apologies.
But Alderman or Director Gordon, I thought, is with us, or Deputy Kwaku, I'm sorry, can't think of your last name, is with us. And so could, if appropriate, can you weigh in on this amendment right here? Because that's what we're talking about. The impact of adding this terminology to this legislation. Kwaku, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, are you hearing? Are you following?
Yes, can you repeat that? Yes, I am. With respect to Alderman Gay's comment on the public transportation.
That's not
you want
what
you
we're...
to make a comment on that?
No. What we're discussing at this point is his First Amendment, which is to simply add the word adequate. And Ross, I don't have numbers. So what line did you say?
Line 40, page 1, line 43.
Page 1, line 43. Could you tell us what the impact of adding that terminology would be? If there is any at all.
Adequate basically refers to the fact that the roadway facility will be able to handle any additional traffic. That's all that it means. So in terms of impacts, if the development doesn't meet the standard, then mitigation rules will apply to make sure that it can carry the traffic that will be generated. So at this point, I don't have any comments in terms of the impacts in general, but the term refers to you have standards that would the road be able to handle the additional traffic that will be generated. And adequacy in this particular case, I believe, will refer to the specific level of service that will be established by council.
Okay, so you're saying that it would not impact your transportation in a negative way by adding this terminology is what I gather.
Madam Chair. No.
If there is a need for mitigation, and one of the options could be how can they improve public transportation to that community, or what can be done to encourage people to basically use the transit to offset any private vehicle trips. So it will not actually at this point impact our public transportation in terms of the word adequacy.
Okay, thank you. Alderman Arnett.
Madam Chair, this is a misdirection. First of all, the Transportation Department has been involved with planning and zoning all along during this. All this legislation is dealing with is triggering a traffic study. It is not speaking to overall adequacy of roads or lines on roads or numbers of stop signs or things like that. That can come after a traffic study when it is determined, the traffic study helped determine the approval or rejection of a project or the request of the applicant that they add stop signs or crosswalks or stoplights. Those come after a traffic study is done. So the primary purpose, and remember, this used to be called, and in fact, still is called in Title 21, Traffic Impact Analysis. It's not anything more than that. We're trying to determine what triggers or how much of an impact a project has to trigger the requirement to do a traffic analysis study, the thing where they put the tubes across the road and they count the cars and they look at how close the intersection for the project would be to another intersection or an intersection that is a failed intersection, those kinds of things. So the principal thrust of this is as it always was, even back in 2006, triggering and then mitigating, triggering a traffic study and then figuring out how to deal with what the traffic study tells planning and zoning in dealing with an application. And I think that's a great source of confusion on the part of many of my colleagues.
Well, hopefully these amendments will clarify that confusion.
That is a hope, but I have my doubts.
We're simply adding a word to the title, and at this rate, we won't get it recommended either way because we won't get it done.
At this rate, I'll get my vaccination before I get the stuff.
Just to clarify, if you look at every other chapter in the adequate public facilities section, it all has the word adequate, everything except for this particular chapter. So I think it's important for consistency to put that in there. But also to point out real quick to Alderman Gay that there's an entirely separate section in the APF ordinance that deals with adequate non-auto transportation facilities. So I think that's the appropriate place to deal with that issue.
Okay, I'm going to call the question on this amendment. All in favor of, it's been moved and duly seconded. All in favor of the first amendment, please say aye.
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 Now,
okay, Ross, Alderman Arnett, second amendment.
Yes, so just a quick word. That what Rob just mentioned, so what Teresa had in mind was we would have automotive transit and non-automotive transit as parallel parts of the APF code, Title 22. And as Rob just mentioned, putting adequate in here makes it parallel with all the other things that are in Title 22 for adequacy, like stormwater and the whole host of other things. So on page 2, for those, the next red line is starting on line 5 of my version, and it is inserting what we mean by automotive transit, because certainly there is bus transit, truck transit, everything. So I wanted to insert the sentence, for the purpose of this code, auto transportation refers to all vehicular traffic on roadways within the city of Annapolis.
Alderman, do you want to take each of these? There's another amendment in that same paragraph in the very next sentence. Could you deal with both of these at the same time? Are they drastically different?
Well, they are different thoughts, but the review and assessment shall consider recommendations of the Director of Public Work and include input from adjacent communities and applicable neighboring jurisdictions when appropriate. Now, quite frankly, this was stimulated by Rhonda because Rhonda wanted to have input from the communities that whose traffic is being impacted by a new development. But it also was input that came from the Eastport Civic Association. So the one defines what auto transit is, which means anything on any motorized vehicles on city roads. And this next one defines that this is a decision of the Public Works Director, but asks that the Public Works Director, which happens all the time, include input from adjacent communities and applicable neighborhood jurisdictions. So it would be input from the community right next to the new project, and it would be input from the Greater Parole Citizens Association or the Eastport Civic Association or the Ward 1 Residents Association. So it's just saying, Director, when you're looking at adequacy, take into account input from the community, which is always done now, the comments from the public on a thing. So there are two different thoughts, but they are in the same place.
Alderman, I'm going to ask you to separate those two.
I had intended to. So okay. The first one is simply defining the term auto transit to be broader than just automobiles, but to include all kinds of vehicular transit on city roadways.
Okay, so it's been moved. Do I get a second?
Second.
Further discussion? Any questions? I'll call the question. All in favor of amendment 2?
Madam Chair, I have a comment.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I can't find, do I get my camera working correct? Alderman, I did mention auto transit. Is that correct? Auto transportation, because there is a difference between the two.
Between which two?
If you did say auto transit, transit specifically refers to public transportation, either by bus or train or whatever. So in that case, you are taking out vehicular trips other than public transportation. So
Dr. Dua, we're not taking anything out. What is being added is the phrase or the sentence, and I quote, "For the purposes of this code, auto transportation refers to all vehicular traffic on roadways within the city of Annapolis." Is that what you're objecting to?
No, I thought I did hear auto transit. That's why I was concerned with.
Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Further discussion on the second amendment? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye.
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 Okay,
Aye.
and the third one, Ross, and you've explained it, but I do have a question. And what concerns me about this amendment is applicable neighboring jurisdictions, which generally refer not to communities. And if that's what was intended, then that's what it should say. Jurisdictions would be other cities, other counties. So
Yes.
why the term jurisdiction?
Because that is exactly the intent. And again, Rhonda has pointed out that she abuts the county and she wants input from the county as well as the city on the impacts on traffic. I did this to be sensitive to what Rhonda was talking about at the Transportation Committee meeting. We can say just input from communities and drop that last, but I was trying to be inclusive of what I thought I heard from Rhonda at the Transportation Committee. But it does specifically mean county, or if it's a state road, state. So they are two other jurisdictions. And one of the things about the city of Annapolis is we have private roads, city roads, county roads, and state roads, all. And so the word jurisdiction means exactly what you interpreted it to mean. And the request is that when the director makes a decision that they're taking in input. So a classic example of this was the coordination of the stoplights on Forest Drive, that all of which speak to each other, except for the state stoplight at Chickapin Round and Aristide Allen, which had a different communication system. And so when they were coordinating the traffic on Forest Drive, the county went to the state and said, can you change the communication system from your light to coordinate with all the other stoplights going down Forest Drive? And so the word jurisdiction there is with intent. If you find that objectionable, I mean, I don't have a problem taking it out, but it was there with purpose.
Well, let me ask, and I understand your explanation, but wouldn't neighboring communities speak to the same cross-boundary
No.
communities? Well,
No,
I mean,
the communities would speak for the people that live in them. The jurisdictions would speak to the governmental jurisdictions, as you pointed out, that control the state road in the case of states, or in the case of the Eastport Bridge, that's a state bridge. It's not even a city or a county bridge. So we have this mishmash of jurisdictions. So all it's saying is listen to the community, listen to the other jurisdiction, governmental jurisdictions. Maybe instead of neighboring jurisdictions, it should be governmental jurisdictions.
Well, I think if that is the intent, then that's what it should say.
Madam Chair.
Alderman Savage?
Yeah, I'd like to try to understand what your concerns are more, Madam Chair, because the way I'm reading it is that it simply allows the communities or jurisdictions, in this case the county, to submit recommendations or other comments. All it says is that the city shall consider them, but not that they're obligated to adhere to any of them. But both of our wards include county roadways, and I think it'd be important to figure out some mechanism for them to be able to submit some comments, especially on their roadways. And I think the city staff already talks to them, especially if the mitigation involves those roadways, but this just allows them to submit formal comments.
I understand, and having worked with all levels on state roads and county roads, I'm pretty aware of what the impact of what this could be. Okay, and my concern in part is we are surrounded by the county, many of whom in those areas, jurisdictions, think that they control what we do in the city. I would much prefer to have communities have input. Our department should be conferring with the state and the county anyway. Shouldn't have to go in the code to say that. Okay, so that gives me trouble. Okay, I'm only one of three, but that gives me trouble. So
what's the harm in putting it in the code, though, in your view?
Because it makes me uncomfortable. Okay. It opens the door that we don't need. That's all. I'm not comfortable with that.
Can I try
Alderman Gay, Alderman Gay has his hand up, please.
Yeah, I think, you're on the jurisdiction part, correct? Yeah, just quickly about that. Because I'd like to get a little additional insight too, because I think Bay Ridge Gardens right at Forest Drive and Bay Ridge, and an issue that has been consistent there is that we've had children be hit, women holding their children, or adults walking across to get to the Shell station or to the Dollar General. And in the past, the fix would have just been to add a stop sign or a light or something. But because it is county and city, we really haven't got any progress. And so would this help in a situation like this, or would it just further complicate the process?
Well, you know what? Dr. Nash is on, and I'm going to ask her to weigh in to help us with this.
Hello.
Hey.
Get in the middle of this fray, Dr. Nash.
What'd you say?
I said, yes, get in the middle of this fray.
Oh, good. I can't wait. By practice, when I'm preparing a scope for a traffic study, I will send it to ADOT or Kwaku for review. And I, as practice, will send it to, if the project is anywhere near Forest Drive, I will send it to the county's engineer for his review. Because a lot of times he does have knowledge of either an improvement in the works or an issue that we don't know about. And I find that to be helpful. I think it's probably a good idea to put that in the guidelines or the regulations so that that's instituted, because I don't think that's always been done. It doesn't mean that you have to do what they tell you, but, I find it very helpful to get that kind of input. I'm not sure exactly how the public input would work, maybe on input on a problematic or dangerous intersection. I think that would probably be helpful. because a lot of times there's intersections that are perceived to be dangerous that it might not really show up in the number of vehicular crashes or something, just because they're not always reported to the police, or there are a lot of near misses, so we won't necessarily know about it. So I think that's fine if we can standardize the way to get those comments. I think it will make for a better scope.
I think the question for me was the term jurisdictions. Not that adjacent communities is much less different, but it's the term jurisdictions as opposed to just leaving it at communities.
Well, I don't go to communities in Anne Arundel County. I go to the jurisdiction and ask their engineer.
Madam Chair, could I
That's just how I currently do it.
This section speaks to responsibility, and the responsibility is for the Director of Planning and Zoning. So that has always been the case. The First Amendment was to clarify that automobile transit is bigger than just automobiles. This one is saying that the review, that the director, Dr. Nash, will also review the assessment shall consider the recommendations of the Director of Public Works. Now, speaking to Dewan's issue, maybe we should say Director of Transportation. I'm sure, Dr. Nash, you talked to Rick Gordon on these things, and include input from adjacent communities, whenever there's a project, particularly if it's a major site design project, the community submit input, and the neighboring jurisdictions, which are the county or the state. It could be, in Dewan's example, it could be from the housing authorities. So it is a broad term, jurisdiction. It is nebulous, just like communities and neighborhoods are somewhat nebulous. But all of these are just saying that the Director of Planning and Zoning will take into account input, as the Director from Planning and Zoning always has. So it's saying, here's the responsibility, it's the Director of Planning and Zoning. Here are some of the things that the Director of Planning and Zoning should take into account. Input from Public Works, input from the community, input from neighboring jurisdictions. Where this could become important, and I hate to bring this up because I'm calling fire in on myself, if there was an approval of a project and there was an appeal, and the appeals are now on the record, so it's not just de novo, but the appealing person or body group could ask, did you take into account input from the state traffic department? And I think you've just heard Dr. Nash say, yes, we did, and we do all the time. And that, did you take input from the community? Yes, we did. Here are the comments that the community submitted on the record. So, but this was just to say the other things, and actually I would kind of welcome, I'd like to hear more from Dewan about this, even adding, and you too, Dr. Nash, Director of Transportation, since this is auto transit, might be a good idea to put Director of Public Works because they maintain the roads, Director of Transportation because they maintain transportation, the community, and the neighboring jurisdictions.
Well, you know, this kind of opens, your further discussion opens another door in that if there is an appeal, and let's say there's an issue in Alderman Gay's ward or in his community, and you want to put a walk light there near the community, Bay Ridge Gardens, and folks from Bay Ridge, let's say, don't like that light there because it impedes their speeding to 50. This gives them a voice, and then they have grounds for an appeal. Is that how that works, Dr. Nash?
I don't know. I think that's a question for the law office of what their standing would be for an appeal.
So if they're listed as a party in the legislation, and I don't know, maybe that is a question definitely for Mr. Lyles.
So if I could summarize, the reason for putting this in was multifold. It came from community associations. It was trying to be sensitive to what I heard Rhonda saying in the Transportation Committee. And I figured, gee, if I'm going to want to get Rhonda's vote, I better get in things that are sensitive to the things she feels she needs. I am the author of this, but if we want to wordsmith it, that's fine. I think that it is simply laying down what already occurs. And quite frankly, if we should have a planning and zoning director that didn't do this, I would really want it in the code to say, you're supposed to do that. You're supposed to coordinate with all of these different entities. That's all part of your responsibility for determining adequacy. So I feel fairly strongly. First of all, I thought this was one of the easy amendments. I didn't think it was going to be a tough one, but I think that it is fairly important to make clear all of the different kinds of things that the planning director would take into consideration as part of their responsibility for determining adequacy. And remember, most of that determination comes, as you'll see when we get down further, by triggering traffic studies.
Okay, there's a motion on the floor. It's been properly seconded. Further discussion? Hearing none. All in favor of amendment number 3, please say aye.
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 Opposed? Nay.
Okay. All right. Moving further down page 2 to line 36 and 37. This is where we're talking about applicability. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped a very important one, line 31. Remember this number that is I'm proposing to be 50 was 400. Jared and Ian felt that 400 was too high a number of new trips. It wasn't triggering enough traffic studies, so they moved it to 250. I initially had in there 100, but I moved it to 50 because during all the discussion, and I'm glad Dr. Nash is here, the county uses 50. And so this number, it's fungible, but I felt it was important to be consistent with the county. So that's why that number is 50. Dr. Nash, you, in meetings we had with you, you were worried that this number might trigger too many traffic studies. I certainly want to be sympathetic to that. And traffic studies, while they're paid for by the developer and they're not hugely expensive, do cost money. So 50 was the number that the Eastport Civic Association recommended. 50 is the number I put in there, but committee is where we massage these things.
So let me be clear. The original language said 400 trips. No. May I finish? The original language said 400, and then it was amended by previous administration to 250. And now you are amending it or attempting to amend it to 50. Is that correct?
50 new trips. Yes, you are correct.
Okay. Dr. Nash, could you respond to that? Do you know the history and why it was 400 and what the impact was when it moved to 250 and what the impact will be if it's moved to 50?
Well, Kwaku might be able to speak to this better than I can. I do know it was 400 when I first started doing them. It was changed to 250. And my concern with the 50 was just that I currently manage them, and it's just a pretty big work product to manage all of them. I don't see how I can do 5 times as many. I'm hoping that if we do change it to 50, it could be tied to the hiring of a new traffic engineer in Public Works who could then take
that.
I volunteer that new person who doesn't exist yet to take this task over for me. So that was kind of my concern with the 50 was I want to make sure we know what we're trying to do, like what the point of the additional studies is, because I think in a lot of cases we aren't necessarily going to get any mitigation. So then we're asking a developer to spend $15,000 for a study that shows us that everything's okay. I mean, I would want to maybe identify problematic intersections or intersections we know have issues, and maybe in that case, a traffic study is triggered no matter what, or make it somehow tied to context. I know that's a lot more complicated, but the county does exempt Odenton and Glen Burnie. Well, they have 250 in those town centers, so not in the Parole Town Center. So they do apply different metrics to different places. So I'm thinking, maybe that's kind of a compromise where we know we have certain problematic intersections. If you use X, Y, and Z criteria in those places, we should always require a traffic study, whether, once the 50 threshold is hit. Otherwise, you can wait till you get to the 250 threshold, or, something like that. But I don't know if you might have more thoughts on that.
Before Dr. Dua speaks, you mentioned the only other urban centers in the county, Glen Burnie and Odenton. And so they do exempt, did I understand you correctly? They do not have the 50 threshold.
They have I think a 250 threshold is my understanding.
Okay.
And then in the Parole Town Center, they have the 50 threshold, but you don't have to do as extensive level of traffic study. You study a smaller area or something like that. So they have a little bit of modifications for different areas.
Okay. I just wanted to point out they're talking about urban centers where they exempt out, and we are an urban center. So we would, if we were lumped in with the county, we would be exempt from that restriction, or not that restriction, but that guideline. Okay, thank you. Dr. Dua, can you respond to this amendment?
Sally did mention about the history. I'm not sure the basis of the 400 new vehicular trips, but we thought that was too high at that time when I was in planning and zoning. So I was happy to see it reduced to 250. Taking it to 50 actually raises a lot of issues. And this afternoon, we did talk to the Anti-Traffic Engineering Division. In fact, according to them, there are several layers of requirements based upon the location and the condition of the road. So if you're looking at a major arteria, which is already congested, no matter what the size of the development, you are required to do the study in order to mitigate that. But to have a blanket number across the city, I do agree with Sally that then the city will need a traffic engineer because neither I or Sally are traffic engineers by profession. We have added it on to study it and then to consult with the state and then the county traffic engineering division to make recommendations, especially where there are issues. So I will agree with Sally that if the city wants to go to 50, it's a whole lot of work for us to add it on to what we are already doing. And therefore, the city needs to look into hiring a traffic engineer who will take upon himself or herself, not only on the traffic impact study, but you will have routine traffic studies and counts so that we will have a historical data and be able to look at what is happening over years for each corridor or any major local street.
Okay, thank you. Alderman Savage.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I think, Madam Chair, you make some compelling arguments regarding the other urban centers in the county and it being consistent with those areas as well. And I think, and I do have questions, I guess, about some examples of Director Nash, if you have examples of other projects that may have met the, like which ones, I guess, for example, met the 250 but didn't meet the 500, and what kind of projects are we talking about that would have to comply with the 50? And if you have any examples, you may be able to throw out there off the top of your head. I do have another question after that, but
I have some data I can pull up, but 50, I think would be almost. I'm afraid to guess, but I think it would be almost any project more than a single family home. I mean, I think it would be a lot more projects, but I don't really have a number for you. But I can look at our chart and see. Also, we do net new, which is also what the county does. I think that should probably be clarified in there too while we're clarifying things. But Kwaku, do you know any trip generation numbers off the top of your head while I try to look up my table?
No, I need to compile. I would have to compile it for the Alderman Savage. Typically, you are thinking of very small projects, especially when it comes to residential areas, very few units. So I can go back and look at the various traffic studies, or alternatively, you can give us a kind of sample and you can look at the traffic generation table to give you an example, like for residential areas, if you have 10 units, this is how much you will generate. If you have 20 or 15, for retail services, given the square footage, you can have this. That gives us an idea of the potential new trip generation that will be associated with any of this new development.
Okay. I have one other question, comment, I guess, and then I'll be done. But I guess, Dr. Nash, regarding your comment that you're still involved with those, I guess, the review or the process, maybe for the getting POs or whatnot for these. I'd like to know more about the process, because it seems like something that the project managers would handle in terms of the project manager for each of these development projects. So for example, whoever's in charge of Chesapeake Grove would be the person reviewing these things. And is it because that whole process requires a certain amount of additional workload? Because is that the issue in terms of why you're doing it and not the project managers?
So, how did I start doing it? So I would say I started doing it when I was a senior planner in comprehensive planning. And I would say it's not rocket science, but it does take a certain amount of expertise that that I've developed and learned over time. I learned from John Arison, and then I learned a lot from Pete Gowald. I've learned a lot from Kwaku. I've learned a lot from the county engineer. And it was always kind of integrated into looking at growth in the city. I do that table of current developments, so I know which developments need to be included. It just kind of evolved that way. I don't I think it's good for one person to do it, because then you can kind of see like, oh, well, I know this is a problem because of such and such, and I know this is a problem because I remember doing this study over here. So I think it's probably a good idea for that person, one person. I don't think I'm necessarily in the right position to do it, but right now I don't see any other availability in my staff of anyone who could take this on. It's a lot of work I have qualified firms who can do these studies, but I have to make sure their contracts are up to date, and I have to keep track of how much money each of them gets for particular projects. I have to write the scope, which isn't straightforward. I have to know proposed use, existing use. I have to look up what intersections are going to be included, and then what background projects are going to be included. I need to look at the state average traffic numbers to figure out what kind of additional background growth numbers we need to include, and that depends on where the project is. I write the scope, then I send it to Kwaku and the county to review. Then I get the cost from the consultant. I in touch with the developer to get the money. I have to move the money through finance. I have to start the purchase order and get that going. Then I authorize the work, they do the work, and then it's a lot of back and forth then, because they do, oh, well, we found this, or, oh, this is the case. And then tell me if I'm boring you, but so then there's,
well, I get.
Then you have to go back to the developer.
I get the point. It's a bit of a tangential.
What do you?
Yeah, I'd say it's a bit of a tangential issue, but I think it's still important to understand the process. But I think my point is, I guess, in all this is I think there are certainly improvements we could try to make to the process to make it easier, even if we stick with the 250. Because, I mean, for example, one thing we do in the county is we have certain contractors, a certain list of contractors on call for specific projects or specific scopes. So you don't have to keep going through and writing new ones. So there may be things we can do with purchasing to help address that.
Well, no, but you still have to write a scope for each project, because it's different. Each project is different. But I do have, fortunately, firms qualified, so I don't have to go out for bid each time. That was even more of a pain. So, it is faster because I can be like, oh, so-and-so, you're next on the list. Send me a cost for this. But I still have to develop the scope based on the project and what else is going on around there. And then when I get the project back, I send it to the county, I send it to Kwaku for their comments. And there's often a lot of mitigation, like, well, this one is having this much delay at this leg. What's causing that? Is there a way to mitigate that? Because sometimes you can't change traffic signal timing if it's on Forest Drive, because those are all adaptive control. So you have to say, like, well, that's not an option. What are you going to do here? And then sometimes we have this brilliant idea and Public Works is like, are you kidding me? No way. So then, it's just a lot of negotiate. If there was an easier way to do it, I would love to find out. I tried to give it to Kwaku the other day and he turned me down. So I'm open to different ideas, but I just think to do more, it would impact the quality of the products we're getting. So I'm not sure if we would end up gaining anything in the end.
Thank you, Dr. Nash. We have a much greater respect for how this process works. And Alderman Savage, you work for the county. You could convince Mr. Nestor to move over to the city and help us. And then during the budget process, you guys can come up with the funding to pay his salary also, so that we can relieve Dr. Nash of this additional responsibility. But thank you. I hope everyone has a clear understanding of exactly what this entails. Further discussion, I see Alderman Arnett and then Alderwoman Tierney.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So I think there's two separable issues here. I mean, while I value Dr. Nash's expertise, I think she's doing so many other things. We really do need to find someone else to do this. That's an issue that isn't really germane to this legislation. What's germane to this legislation is what's the right number for line 31. If it isn't 50, is it something less than 250? And I'll tell you what triggered this, and Rob, you'll remember this, was, what was it called? Was it Primrose Hill, the project that was proposed and then withdrawn, but it didn't get a traffic study. And it was
Central Park.
Yeah, Central Park, right. So it was smaller, but it was below the 250 count. And that was one that many of us felt really needed a traffic study. So these numbers don't come out of the air entirely, but they do come because they're prompted by a specific situation. Dr. Nash, what number would this be to have had Central Park get a traffic study? If it isn't 50, is it 150? Is it 292? What did we need to do? Because certainly it didn't get caught up with the current 250 level of new trips a day. Mm-hmm. So that's what I was looking for. And if it isn't 50, this is just a number.
Well, I know that if it were 43 units, that would have triggered the 250. Now, they did get some credit for the existing houses that was there. But so like the difference between 400 and 250 is for townhomes, it would be 69 units for 400, and for 250, it's 43. So it's, that maybe gives you an idea. Or for like a restaurant, it was 83 seats. That was 400. But for 250, it's 52 seats. So, so I'm not sure. I haven't done the research for what it would be for 50, but, something smaller than a 52 seat restaurant.
But your sense is, and you are the most expert here, that 50 would promulgate a lot more studies and possibly a lot of studies that wouldn't really be necessary. I accept that. You're the expert. Are you saying we stay at 250? Is there not a lower number that would have captured Central Park? Do we make it 200 or 175? Well,
I would love it if we could think of some criteria, which I think maybe you did start working on for safety. And if we could have a more quantitative way to determine safety, or, maybe it's number of pedestrians crossing and, or turning, maybe let me just be more coherent here. So I'd love if there was a quantitative way where we could assess safety and then require studies based on that, or any other quantitative measures where we could say, if it's not just number of new trips, it's this other condition as well that could trigger it. And then I'd be more comfortable with it being a lower number, because it wouldn't be every one, and it wouldn't be in a situation where we're not really worried about the traffic in whatever area this is. It wouldn't trigger it because of that.
Dr. Duwa, and then Mr. Johnson. I'm sorry, did I skip Alderwoman Tierney?
Yeah, I just if you could just indulge me for this question, because it came up in the transportation review.
Could I come back to you then, because we're answering the Alderman question?
Yeah, I shouldn't have framed it that way. My question is, instead of these numbers fluctuating and being more subjective, aren't there guidelines, specifically the Baltimore Metropolitan Council, their regional traffic impact study guidelines? I mean, do we have some baseline, I'm saying, for guidelines? It sounds like we're really making this very subjective. Am I mistaken?
Well, a lot of the jurisdictions in the Baltimore metropolitan region do things really differently, and that is what the BMC's report looked at. they did suggest some best management practices. And for us, what I took from that report is that we need to focus on safety more. But I think Alderman Arnett is, I mean, that's where you got the 50 is because that is what the county does for, you know, most of the county. In 2016, I pulled numbers from other jurisdictions and, you know, they're seemingly all over the place. So, you know, I'm happy to update. In fact, I have on my to-do list to update that comparison of other jurisdictions. Also, more municipalities, because the BMC is all pretty big counties. So a lot of them have situations like the Anne Arundel County where they have some rules for rural or suburban areas and then different rules for their more urban areas. So, you know, I'm happy to update my table looking at Frederick and Rockville and other municipalities of that size.
Dr. Dua, and then Mr. Johnson, Director Johnson.
Just a quick comment on the number. If we go back to the city code, we do have 3 factors that could trigger traffic impact study. It's not only the threshold, but also the safety and the closeness of the intersection. So, the director of planning is only based upon his or her perception of the traffic issues can actually require a traffic impact study for the area. So I don't think we need to focus so much on the number because it's one of at least the current 3 factors that will determine whether we need to do traffic impact study or not. Alderman Tyranny did mention about the BMC thing. We were trying to take a look at what is out there because if you look at the literature, there is no specific standard to say, okay, if you are in this area based upon this condition or urban characteristics or rural, this is the number you need to use. Most of the time, it's very contextual based upon the context that you're looking at and the experiences over time. So what the BMC did was to look at what we do here in the Baltimore region, what are the best practices, and they have one column if you have taken a look at the final report, what they are recommending for. And as Sally did say, safety is becoming a very important issue. And in this case, we do have safety, but it is not well defined because sometimes your safety data may reflect the accident or the crash data. But what about near misses, which we may not have any record of that? So while we are looking at safety, the other factors can come in, even based upon other experiences from the community that we need to take a closer look at this to examine it, not necessarily because it will require any mitigation, but to give us a better understanding of what is happening in that area.
Madam Chair, if I could interject before we go to Mr. Johnson. This applicability section has those safeties. It's 1 or 2 or 3. So one of them has to do with the number of new trips, another has to do with the accidents nearby, and a third one has to do with how close the egress and exit from the new development is to other exits and egresses. So I think all along it has done that. It's been intended to do that. What I'm grappling for, what I would really love is a number that would have brought Central Park in to have gotten a traffic study. If it isn't 50 and it wasn't 250, it has to be some number in between. And I'm flexible, you know, whatever that number would be, but that was quite a controversial development in a very concentrated area with a lot of traffic issues. And so the only reason for offering this amendment was to get a number that would bring that in. I was pretty sure 50 would do it. If 200 would do it or 175, whatever it is that would do it, that's fine. Sorry for interrupting, Mr. Johnson. I really do want to hear from you.
Oh, that's okay, Alderman. I don't think that 50 is necessarily a problem, a major problem. I think that traffic impact studies vary in size and complexity, and the legislation can be crafted to account for that. In other words, the number of intersections that should be included in your traffic impact study are would be predicated upon the number of new trips that are generated. And I think that's probably a good way to sort of introduce some rationality into the decision, so it's not entirely subjective, as you were saying. So that, for instance, if you said, say, that trips between 50 and say 250, I heard that being used, you might look at one signalized intersection, and that would sort of give like a certain size of study. But suppose you had a mega project that generated, say, 2,000 new trips. Well, you might want to study, 5 intersections or 6 intersections, and that becomes a much bigger study. And the review of those large studies is where specialized traffic consultants are useful. For small studies, staff can often review those because they're not terribly complicated. They're not really, you don't have to have specialized software or skill or expertise in that area to review it. But a traffic study, impact study, should be performed for any development. I think that's a part of the APF process. That's a good practice. But you can sort of calibrate it based on the number of trips and the number of the number of intersections that you require the developer to study, and that would give us a sliding scale of price. I don't know if that would help in sort of what you're discussing.
And if I could respond to that, Madam Chair, if you go to the next page to standards, there really are those things. There's groupings of 50 or whatever the number is to 250, and then more than 250, and it has different mileages. One's a quarter of a mile, another's a half mile. So when you get to the standards part of this, I think those kinds of concepts are introduced. Right now, in this section, we're talking about applicability. What would apply to do a traffic impact analysis? The standards section, which of course I have a lot of things to talk about there. The standards section is where you get that kind of range flexibility, and it's not only a number of trips, but it's distances from the project, quarter of a mile, half a mile.
But is the sort of distance necessarily correlating well to the intersection? I think the intersections are more critical in a study because that's where you have merging trips and different turning movements and signalized timing, and things of that nature, as opposed to just a half a mile, which it may fall between intersections, for instance.
I couldn't agree with you more, and that's in the standard section. Fewer trips in shorter distance, quarter of a mile, more trips, bigger distance, half mile. I've had people urging that we make it a mile and a half. But right now we're just trying to deal with this one number on line 31 of page 2. Dr. Nash, if we change that number to 150, would it have brought Central Park in to have a traffic study, do you think?
Yes, number was 168.
So can we amend the amendment to say instead of 50, would that have satisfied the particular instance that precipitated the desire to change this number?
Dr. Nash, I think that's for you.
Oh, I'm sorry. What?
Instead of reducing this all the way to 50, if we reduced it from 250 down to 150, I think you said that Central Park did 168. So that would have generated a traffic study for that.
Yes, correct.
So my colleagues on the committee, what's your comfort level of making this number 150 or 168 even? 150 is what I would prefer, but
Are we designing this piece, this amendment to serve a certain project?
It was an example of something that was really very problematic. It was a very controversial for a number of reasons, not just traffic. And because of the high threshold of 250 new trips, that project slipped under. And so, yeah, not just my ward, the ward that's in, people were saying that should have gotten a traffic study.
Well, it's not an active project, though, just to clarify. So it's not, we're not trying, this isn't trying to be crafted to apply to any specific project, because it's not, that application was withdrawn. According, right, Dr. Nash?
Well, my question really was, are we targeting projects, period? Dr. Nash, I want you, and then I'm going to call on Alderman Gay and Ms. Johnson.
Well, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, your turn.
Oh, well, I would say we probably should talk big picture a little bit. Just see what exactly we want to gain from doing more traffic studies. I hear there's a lot of concern about congestion, vehicular congestion in the city. So does that mean everyone's on board with prioritizing eliminating or reducing vehicular congestion, doing whatever we can to eliminate that? Or is there more interest in trying to balance vehicular congestion with safety, which also competes with vehicular level of service, or other modes like walking and biking, which also often compete with vehicular congestion? So I just would want to point out that if you are favoring one metric, then you might be impacting other metrics. And if I could get a sense from the council on how those metrics, what you see as your policy goals for those metrics, it would probably help us get to the point where we can all agree on this legislation.
Mr. Johnson, what would you think about moving that number to 150?
Well, I think that, it may have unintended consequences, because not every development, are we sort of saying that sounds like maybe like a mid-sized development and we're only concerned with those, but you're not concerned with those that might generate smaller numbers of new trips to an already congested network of roads? I don't really see, as I'd said, 50 as being necessarily a major problem if you sort of circumscribe the number of intersections that you require to be studied, because then that sort of then dictates the size of the traffic impact study, right? The study zone is then circumscribed by that criteria. And it doesn't have to become a major study. It's something that, every development, I think, should probably do. And, they'd be fairly straightforward to review and would not require a lot of specialized skill to review those developments. For the major developments, which generate large numbers of trips, say north of 500 or more, that would probably require specialized review, because you have more intersections in there and you have to look at, an entire more complex model to sort of make sure that it works.
Okay, so I think I'm hearing you say you're good with 50.
I'm okay with 50. I understand Sally's concern, because she's sort of, we haven't been struggling to get a traffic engineer, and it's a kind of a hard commodity to come by. But I don't think that 50 is a terrible number to work with.
And I think I heard.
I think certainly if it was tied if the number was tied to the size of that, the number of intersections that needed to be counted, that's really what drives the cost of these things. So I like the idea of saying, well, if it's this, then you only have to do these intersections. And I mean, that's so much easier and to do. So I think what we're all kind of saying is that it's not really a one size fits all approach, even in the city, that ideally there's some nuances depending on where exactly you are and the size of the intersection and what exactly is happening there. The tricky part is figuring out how we get those nuances into the code.
Dr. Dua, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, Sally did mention about what we are trying to do here, because if you take Prince George's County, there are areas where almost all the intersections within the proposed development are failing. And yet there are places that they want to develop. So they do accept even level of service F, only that they try to mitigate that. So if the idea of the city is to encourage development in a very sound, wise way, then we need to do a little bit more homework in terms of what is the threshold or what are the triggers. What I'm seeing here is that we have residential area, we have retail, we have services, we have professional offices, and each one has a different third generation characteristics. So if you want to come to a number, we may want to do a little bit more research. Basically, we can create various scenarios and then create certain number of units or square footage and say, okay, with this table, you have a better picture of what's going to happen if we have this proposed development coming in. Right now, we are looking at 50, 250, 400, and as we have also noted, across the state, we don't have even an objective way of determining what is the threshold. So while 50 may be all right, we may want to take some time and look at it in a more comprehensive way to develop something that is very sound in terms of what will be the basis for even trip generation. We normally do early analysis as Director Johnson did indicate. So when it comes to me, I can take a look at it and say, okay, it's not going to meet the threshold. However, we have issue here, so we would like the traffic and the developer to take a closer look at the traffic impact because of this specific issue. So we always do that without detailed analysis of it. But when we see that there is a major problem, then we will ask them to do a much more comprehensive traffic impact analysis to give us a better understanding of what are the issues there. So if the city wants to take some time and look at it in a more comprehensive way, come up with various scenarios, create a table, give us an idea of the potential trip generations based upon the type of development and the scale, I think we may be better off.
Thank you. Alderman Savage and then Alderman Annette.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, Alderman Gay's next. Go ahead, Alderman Savage.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see the point from the directors in the sense that what you're saying, I think, is for if we go with 50, and even if I think if we go with 50, then it'd be helpful to have to add more information to the legislation that would have different standards or a different type of study, a simpler study that would be easier on staff and the developer to do. And I think that was the intention with Alderman Arnett's, one of the intentions with the legislation. I think it does that to a certain degree. So, I think if the directors, I don't know if the directors would be open to sending us some of those standards we could either incorporate into this or do later on as a part, as a follow-up legislation. But I do think, and maybe at this point, I'd be happy to just second the motion for the 150 amendment to keep it at 150, and then maybe we wait and see if we get different standards from staff.
Is that accepted as a friendly, or Alderman Arnett, did you make a motion to change?
I had asked Dr. Nash for a number that would have gotten a project the size of Central Park, a traffic study. She said 168, so I said, well, then let's make this 150. It won't generate as many traffic studies as Dr. Nash, but I really would urge everybody to remember that this is a three-part applicability thing here. One is just a threshold level. If you generate this number of trips or more, you're going to get a traffic study. If you're generating trips near a failing intersection or an intersection that has a lot of accidents, you're going to get a traffic study. And if you're generating a project that has an intersection, an entrance or egress really close to other entrances and egresses, you're going to get a traffic study. And I think all of those speak. I agree with what Dr. Nash brought up about what are the objectives. And the objectives are the impact of traffic, and if a project is bringing a traffic impact, how do we mitigate that? Do we add a left turning lane? Do we add a new stoplight? Rhonda talked at the meeting the other night about how many years it took her to get that stoplight in Ward 3. This kind of study would say, we can improve your project, but you need to add a stoplight at Americana and Chesapeake Avenue because of the traffic study. So that's why we do traffic studies. The whole purpose of this was to do the analysis, to find out if there were problems, and if there were problems, what can we do to solve it? And that's the basis of all of the adequate public facilities. Do the analysis, come up with what we can allow. Maybe you can't have as big a project as you applied for, or maybe you can have a bigger project, but if you make these kinds of capital investments, or you pay this kind of, in a meeting we had with Dr. Nash and citizens, with the whole issue of impact fees came up again. Maybe you can do this project if you pay a big enough impact fee so that Public Works can make some corrections to turning lanes or to stoplights or stop signs or pedestrian crossing signs. You know, you pay for that, you get approval. So again, the whole purpose of this is to look at that whole range of safety and congestion and alternate forms of transit, all of that. So yes, 150 was just to get us off this dime because we haven't even gotten to the hard parts yet.
Alderman Gay.
Thank you. I would just add that I am concerned, you know, as an alderperson, when I hear, you know, as you mentioned earlier, it seems as targeted approaches to certain projects by certain community organizations. And that is a project that's in my ward anyway, you know? And so I think to target them even around remotely, 150, 165, whatever, so that a specific area or specific developments have to be reviewed for the sake of a community organization is dangerous. And I think it gives too much authority to the community organizations as they continue to have a significant stake in appeal processes based on circumstances like this, when we conflict the code with interest of residents. And so that's worrisome to me. I support this project in general, but the last amendment and this amendment, I'm concerned about both of them.
Can I respond quickly? Targeting is not what we're talking about. We were talking about an example of something that really needed a traffic impact study, but because it was below the threshold, it didn't get it. So the impetus was to lower the threshold. It wasn't, that project has been withdrawn. So it can't be targeting it, and targeting is not what we're talking about.
It has been withdrawn, but let's say for future development is proposed. I think what I shouldn't say what you were doing. What it appears as if is that even if any future development is proposed there, they would have to meet the number that is being proposed today. And what I'm hearing through conversation is that it was, you know, moving it too low creates work for an already overburdened office, and extending it too high or at the 450 creates a problem. So I'm not understanding why wouldn't it be at the 250 that it's at?
I think it's a good question. I'd probably use the term targeted because that's how it felt as we're having this discussion. And as I've watched this evolve for the last 10 years. So, you know, that was very, I think, descriptive from my perspective. So maybe that's where that came from, Alderman Gay.
Yeah, and I could have used a different word.
Duan, were you asking for a response? Because my response to you is all of this legislation, in fact, all of our legislation restricts property use. That's what zoning does. Zoning says, for the good of the community, we're going to come in and control the things you can do and the amount of things that you can do on your property. And this is one of those things where we're saying, if your project generates X number of trips or X proximity to a dangerous intersection, we're going to take a closer look at it, and we may restrict your use of your property. That is what zoning is all about.
I think that's fine, but my point, Ross, that I'm attempting to make is that I don't think that we should lower the number significantly. I think 250 may be fine, because what it does is creates a really anti-development, because as we move toward a more mixed use and multi-development phase in our city, that only creates boundaries for developers as they come in. And let's face it, with the lack of space, most of the developments that would be created would qualify for a traffic study if it even stayed at 250. So I just would caution that we don't move too low, as I think it'll create more work for planning and zoning and create a message of anti-development or anti-mixed use for the city. And I just think that that's something that we shouldn't do.
So look, our job is to set overall policy objectives, and then the staff and the city manager will carry them out. Doing a traffic study does not stop a project, but it does say, in order to do it, you, Mr. Developer, may need to do some extra things to accommodate the community that you're introducing yourself to. This is not a stop development. It is saying do a development that accommodates the surrounding community.
All right. I think I'm going to call on Alderman Savage next. But, you know, I think we are getting far astray from really what our committees are supposed to be doing. I would like to have seen this discussion with the department heads in advance so that we would know exactly up front where the departments are and what how their input is valued on these subjects, instead of us having, you know, we're never going to get through this legislation, and we're not going to get to the other pieces of legislation that are on our agenda because we're doing things that I feel should have been taken care of in advance of it coming before this committee, or any committee for that matter. They
were. There have been 2 years of ongoing discussions on this legislation. What's happening is this committee is focusing on the culmination of all of those discussions. You can ask Dr. Nash the number of different times, various groups, and the number of different times this has come up with the Forest Drive Eastport sector study, the number of times this is going to come up again with the comp plan. This is not something that's just plopping down out of nowhere. This has been an ongoing dialogue for 2 years.
Alderman, I would say that if there was a consensus, which is what I would have appreciate seeing, then we would not have 3 different department heads saying 3 different things at this time. And so, you know, it's like we're going to keep trying it until we get what we want. You know, it's just not fair. We've had people sitting here waiting to hear about other pieces of legislation, and we've gotten to amendment 3 or 4 out of 14. You know, can we do some of this work and get some, you know, consensus before it comes before the committees? Or then we only, if not, then we only schedule one piece of legislation per meeting, because that's been the record that we've been going on right now. And if that's good with you guys, it's good for me.
I would just respond by saying we're trying to.
It doesn't need a response. Alderman, I'm sorry. Alderman Savage.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I mean, just my view on that is just that I feel like this is why we have committees, because we do want to make it a public process and not just develop the legislation behind closed doors with the directors. I think this is good. I think I'd be open to having meetings just focused on one particular legislation, especially if we need, because we're trying to get everybody's input. That's why we have so many members here. But in response to Alderman Gay, you know, all of our laws and regulations have standards and thresholds, be it the NPDU legislation or grading permits have thresholds when they kick in, or building permits, or building code, everything, environmental code, critical area, all of them have different standards. So I don't think it's fair to say simply because we have a standard that we're targeting. We're trying to learn from past experiences, and this was a large development that was proposed in your ward before you were alderman that was large enough where the community said, hey, this seems like they need to have some kind of impact because we're afraid this is going to contribute traffic. I really don't think this is anti-development to say that, because the whole idea behind APF is to have the developers mitigate their impacts. Is it really anti-development to say they should be having no impact on our communities? I mean, if they're going to be contributing traffic, all it says is, okay, they have to mitigate it. They have to make up for it, right? Improve our infrastructure. That seems completely fair to me. I mean, we do the same thing with the stormwater, watershed restoration. We do we try to do something similar with education. There's something they can pay into for county schools. So, I mean, that's the whole underlying premise behind the adequate public facilities. And it's kind of related to Dr. Nash's question about policy goals, because I think we try to respond to, again, these problems that we've seen happen. And we've had problems where some projects got approval, even though it said they were going to be causing failing intersections. They still got their certificate of adequate public facility because it was said that there was no mitigation they could do. No mitigation, because essentially the county was saying, oh, you can't do mitigation on our road, but we don't want any more. So even though it was going to be a failing intersection, they still got approval to go through. And that seems a bit odd. So what this legislation tries to do is respond to that, but also other things where we have situations where if you have 5 different pending projects, if each one goes in individually to look at their own individual impact, they're not taking into consideration the cumulative impact of all these other development projects. And so what some of the amendments in this legislation do is to require them and allow staff to kind of say, okay, here are the cumulative impacts. Here's some cumulative solutions that the developer might be able to pay into, because the mitigation might be too expensive for any one individual project, but this allows them to pay into something larger than that, make it like a capital improvement project. And again, it's not anti-development. It's more oriented in how do we respond to the public and address their concerns about our infrastructure.
Further discussion, Alderman Gay.
Yeah, thanks. I should just add that, again, I'm not opposed to the idea of the traffic study. I just think that lowballing it creates, unintended consequences both on the staff And I think on the developer, because as I mentioned, we can only, get larger in terms of developments because of the lack of space that we have. I would definitely support it as it stands at 250 or greater, because to your point, I'm aware of the failing intersections. Since we're using the Central Park development as an example, if something like that would have been proposed, one of the immediate exits would have been straight down Tyler, which would have brought it to the intersection of Tyler and Forest, which is where Robinwood, the gas station, and the liquor store is. And in the Eastport Forest Director traffic study, which I studied before, getting elected briefly, just trying to get updated on some things, that intersection was rated an F. It was actually, in fact, one of the worst in the city. So I do see the benefit of a developer contributing to the cost of that. And I think they would, because the project would be large enough that they would already be included in that traffic study. My fear was just that lowering it would create unintended consequences. I should have clarified that without using the inappropriate language of targeting. That was my mistake.
Alderman Arnett.
Madam Chair, I think you are correct, though, in pointing out that this is going very slowly and it's backing up other legislation. Perhaps what we might want to think about doing is suspending our discussion of this, setting up another meeting of the Rules Committee where it accommodates us all, and see if we can clear out some of the other legislation. I think some of these other things are simpler than this piece of legislation. I do want to go forward with this. It has waited a long time. I put, and others, a lot of effort into this, and I'd like to at least have the opportunity to be heard on it. If the majority of the council doesn't see the wisdom of this, that's how things always go. They don't get passed. But I think that I'd at least like to be able to go through these in a timely fashion, and would ask that maybe we consider postponing the discussion of this, convening another Rules Committee, or even waiting until the next Rules Committee and go on with some of the other pieces of legislation. I don't know if that suits you or not.
Alderwoman Tierney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Could I make just a general question or a recommendation so that this does not, fail? Is there a way that we can add more latitude to this by focusing more on the process of review versus putting in finite numbers? I mean, I think the public would be reassured as far as us meeting our safety requirements from the state and all that. If we assure them that this is a collaborative effort between the different departments, if we focus more on the process, again, instead of trying to pigeonhole these numbers, it's just a suggestion to so that the legislation does pass in some way, shape, or form.
Well, I would say one of the things we discovered in the Forest Drive Task Force is there is a lot of coordination, not only between departments already, and you've heard Kwaku and Dr. Nash, Dr. Dua and Dr. Nash bantering back and forth. They cooperate a lot, and I think Mr. Johnson is jumping into the game. We don't see it, but I think that this whole piece of legislation is about process. And the amendment that we just passed, where we were adding back up in the responsibility section, and we have the Director of Public Works, I'd even propose that we add in there specifically Director of Transportation, and I'd be certainly open to that amendment. But this is all about process. We cannot, as alderpersons, tell department heads or any other staff what to do. We can suggest it as a part of the policies that we set forth, and this does suggest that kind of coordination. Fortunately, they're all bright enough and good enough that they know to do that without us. They didn't need us to tell them to work across the departments, but it is nice to have it. And particularly if we have a new director that didn't know that that was supposed to happen or decided they didn't want it to happen. But this is all about process.
I was going to suggest, and I appreciate the recommendation of postponing action on this legislation. What makes me uncomfortable is the fact that we have 3 different department heads here, and they all have different expertise and different ideas about this. And I would like to see there be some consensus about what comes before us. And this is no effort to hide anything that we're doing or to not be transparent. It's an effort to coordinate and collaborate on our legislation before it gets to us. That does not stop us from having any discussion and asking any questions that we want of the experts in our employ. However, some of these things do need to be worked out in advance of bringing it before us. So that is what I'm asking. And it'll take another whole Rules Committee meeting to take care of all of these amendments, I'm fine with that.
Me too.
And let me say right now, Alderman Arnett, I owe you an apology. I should not have shut you down. That was unprofessional on my part. But this is my frustration trying to chair this committee, and we are on page 2 of the first piece of legislation. I'm just saying, we have to do better.
No apology necessary, and this is very complicated legislation. I get it. Much more than we ordinarily deal with. This is like Forest Conservation Act kinds of complexity. And I think we need to take the time, and I totally agree with you. I think there's more coordination amongst the departments and staffs than we may know, but absolutely that is desirable. Yes, and I'm not so sure. Of course, I like Mr. Johnson's answer because he liked my number, but
Mr. Johnson, I understand with your picture, but it's different.
I totally understand Dr. Nash's concern about. I mean, the workload, the staff workload, we changed that by getting more staff, but whether it's necessary to do all of these studies is something I'm much more interested in. If we're making it 50 and now we're doing studies pro forma by rote and they don't make any difference, that doesn't make sense. And so I was looking for guidance from Dr. Nash about, I do think the number needs to be lower, but if it's too low, it's too low. I'm not going to try to force a number that's stupid. Well, maybe I would in a bad day, but I'm trying not to.
Well, I'd be happy to organize some meetings with ADOT and DPW and P&Z where we could hash out some ideas we have, and then I can circle back to you, Alderman Arnett, and see if you like what we've come up with.
I would appreciate that. And I'm taking to heart the fact that 2 other committees have looked at this and have said, rewrite it. If I were asked to rewrite it, I would really rewrite it like the red line version. But, you know, that maybe I'm just being pig-headed. So I think we need to take the time to do this right. We don't have to have it done by, well, we have to have it done by the first meeting in June for it to get through this term. I would really prefer that, but I'm not interested in pushing it to the floor if people aren't comfortable that it's not in the right place. That's just not good governance.
Okay, so do I hear a motion to postpone action on 01919? I see Ms. Green's hand. And she disappears. There she is.
No, I'm here. I just wanted to say that you guys are on Amendment 4. So that's on the floor still.
Well, if we postpone action on the entire ordinance, that includes the amendments that we've started to discuss, does it not?
Well, the other ones you've already dispensed with. This one you have not taken a vote on, so I just wanted to point that out. Also, Alderman Arnett, for Amendment 4, which you guys were discussing, you said line 31, and it's actually line 32, so I just wanted to clear that up as well.
Well, not on my document, but it's we get the idea.
Okay.
Yeah, mine didn't have numbers at all, so it doesn't matter. But great.
Okay.
So if we take an action to postpone, that postpones us from this point on. That includes the discussion on Amendment 4.
Right. So I make that motion, and hope we can. I'd like to hope we can schedule another Rules Committee meeting, but if not, postpone it till the next Rules Committee.
I'll second that.
Did you second it? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Okay. And Dr. Nash is going to convene a meeting with the directors to kind of hash out and come up with some recommendations. That would be terrific. Okay, all in favor of postponing action on 01919, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Okay, thank you. What's on the agenda that's left is animal control, and we were supposed to have 2 visitors here, and I have not seen them, and so Ms. Green.
Robin's here.
He's here. I'm gonna call her.
I'm sorry, we've kept her, okay. I know that there has been an interest in pulling this legislation, Alderman Payon.
Yes, Madam Chair. The problem is that there's not a ton wrong with the legislation right now, except much of it is, well, it's already law in the city. And I have no desire to repeat that. The law department told me way back when that there was no provision requiring leashing of dogs in the county code. And they were mistaken in that. And unfortunately, I didn't know that until I'd already filed the legislation. We don't have copies of the county code. And I had to go down to the law office and actually get one of the attorneys to spend time on this. And we pretty much agreed that, well, Robin, I'm sorry you've had to wait so long. It's always good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Our little dog that you picked out for us, Max, is sitting right here. He's 12 years old and he's a good boy.
Well, that's awesome.
When he sleeps.
Ms. Catlin, yes, I do apologize. I could not see you on my screen, so I didn't know you were waiting, because I would have called you forward before now to say, go home and have dinner. Knowing that we were going to go longer than we had anticipated. But I'd like, while you're here, to share with us, if you might, actions that your department have taken along with our police department in addressing this problem.
Sure. So I missed a little bit of the intro. Sorry about that. And I apologize for any child or animal noises that you hear in the background.
No problem.
I came home so that I could make sure I wouldn't interfere too much with the evening plans. And so the loose dog issue in Annapolis has been something that's been a problem for some time. And Anne Arundel County Animal Care and Control have done our best to assist with it when we can. I think it's 29 pages of like loose dog patrols and other things like that I printed up before the meeting today because we have some areas that have been particularly chronic. Mr. Payon may have already said, or Alderman Payon may have already said about Phoenix School being a problem in that area, and some of the areas having significant chronic problems where we have these owners that are treating them like off-leash dog parks. And most recently, even just the other day, I heard on the radio one of our officers responding because a constituent contacted us again And when she came up on the school property, there were 3 owners with dogs off leash. As she went to approach them, they took off running with their dogs. They leashed them up and hightailed it out of there. Fully staffed, Anne Arundel County Animal Care and Control has 10 allotted officers for the entire county. 2 of those handle about 2,000 bites and animal attack investigation each year. So those 2 really don't count. So that leaves 8 for covering services to the community from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. Monday through Friday and Saturdays from 10 to 6. So at most, if we're fully staffed, right now we actually have 3 vacancies for animal care and control officers. So we only have 7 officers for the entire county and the over 6,000 calls that we handle per year. And so at most it's 4 officers for a given shift, working a county with over 550,000 people. So as you can imagine, when we get these calls that people are using the schools or other places as an off-leash dog park, we say, you know, we'll try to get there as soon as we can, but we have to prioritize those calls. There are many days that it's only 1 officer on the road. I know when Alderman Payon and Animal Care and Control and the City of Annapolis Police Department met, we discussed that we just can't get there that quickly. And also we don't have our animal care and control officers in pursuit of people that are running away with their animals. That's not something that they're really trained or equipped to deal with. So we need people to be, you know, cooperative. We're trying to help as much as we can, but we were also asked, could we do, you know, like early morning Sunday patrols or early morning Saturday patrols when it's a bigger issue? And unfortunately, that would require overtime for us, which of course everyone knows it's used to dealing with budget stuff. That's especially difficult to do when we're just a tiny little piece of the Anne Arundel County Police Department budget. So staffing is low, and then asking already overburdened staff when we're short staffed to take on more overtime is something that we just can't feasibly manage. So, you know, we thought of ways that we could try to enforce this by having police officers essentially send us a copy of their report when they do this so we can issue citations. You know, we've looked for ways that would be more amenable and hopefully, you know, easier for everybody, but in that we discussed, it seemed like the best thing to do was make it so that we could have a team effort. And of course, that wouldn't mean Animal Care and Control stopping our efforts to assist with the problem. It would just put more boots on the ground and maybe closer to the problem to help curb it faster.
Well, I think what might end up happening, I mean, we don't have the facilities to take a dog or to do much of anything other than write citations. And I think we would have to work along with you folks if there was a dog that was running loose that appeared to be rabid or appeared to be out of control and running loose. You know, I'm sure we'd have to develop some plan of action where the police they'd go ahead, write the citation and do the best they could, but I'm sure they would end up calling you to, you know, hey, come get Rover, and he's been a very bad boy, and you know, we got to get him out of here. We can't do that. I mean, we can't build a kennel. We can't
absolutely
do any of that. It's too expensive, and yeah, you guys probably do that much better than we would anyway.
And I think the bulk of these complaints are ones that have owners present. You know, we already respond and do the animal enforcement for the city as best we can, resources permitting. So those confined stray animals or aggressive animals, things like that, they're things that we respond to. And of course, an aggressive animal is going to be a higher priority response for us than dogs that people are just kind of letting have fun at a community property where they shouldn't be.
Well, this isn't as a result of any lack of effort that we perceive from animal control. I mean, I'm aware of it. It is just a matter of somebody is, the nearest person is on a call in Millersville. Not only do we have to wait for the call to be taken care of, but, you know, Millersville's depending on where in Millersville, it could be as much as a half hour away, and traffic longer than that. While I have you, can I get your number? I need to talk with you anyway, I think.
Alderman Payon, why don't you let her put that in the chat box so she doesn't have to display it publicly?
Okay, I couldn't find how to message in the chat box.
Can I, while you're doing
Email
that,
it to you?
that's a good idea.
Okay.
Thank you. Let's go on Alderman Savage and then Alderman Gay.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Scallett, for coming this afternoon, this evening, and being patient with us. So, it's very helpful to have you here to hear your remarks, and I think one of my concerns was the police officers, if they had enough training to be able to do any of these enforcement actions. You know, I'd hate to see a situation as an owner of 2 dogs. You know, I'd hate to see a situation where an officer may not be sufficiently trained and misread a dog or the situation and get injured themselves or unnecessarily injure the dog. So, I mean, you're the expert here though, so do you have those concerns? Would you recommend if we offer our officers, if we go down this route, that we give our officers additional training, or just somehow improve the communication process with your department?
So I don't have approval to have county support one way or another at this point officially on the bill. But I'm always a fan of training. We in fact offer Anne Arundel County Police Department officers. They get some additional training. We actually have one of our officers attend all of the training academies that the Anne Arundel County police officers do to just go over some of those various things, reading animals' body language, things like that, to help keep them safe and discuss use of force. If necessary for an animal, though certainly not the route we're hoping we're going. We're hoping that these officers will be getting the people that feel like public areas are fun areas, and most of the time those are going to be reasonably friendly animals, and more of the problem will be the people, hopefully, than the animals. But certainly, I'm confident that we could arrange if the police department wanted one of our ACOs to come out and do the presentations that we already do for the Anne Arundel County Police Department, or something, along those lines, to help provide that support or provide other. There are some really great law enforcement geared trainings for animals that I can provide links to that are free, that officers can go online and do them. And they're little 15-minute trainings that they can do that just help prepare them better for the things that they might experience then, because obviously officer safety and public safety needs to be a priority for everybody.
And it sounds like the sponsor may be going in a different direction with this anyway, but if we do ever decide to do this, would you, I guess, recommend we do something like that for our officers before putting them in this kind of situation?
As far as I know, I think some officers are already responding now based on our meetings way back when. They just felt like they didn't have the tools to respond when they got there. So they felt like they were just kind of going and then saying, okay, everybody, you have to stop, but not feeling like they had a method of actually addressing the problem. Okay. At least that was my perspective on the meeting that I had back with the city police about a year ago, was because, they were responding because they happened to be close. So they were already finding themselves in those situations. And again, some of the most helpful trainings, so there's little 15-minute trainings that if there was a good contact for me to send it to the police department, they can be emailed out to police all. I'm sure the city of Annapolis has that, similar to we do, in the county, and say, these have to get done, or have a mechanism for making sure that everybody has that information just for their own safety pretty quickly.
Okay. Madam Chair, if I just have one quick question for the sponsor, just Alderman Payon, what direction are you planning on going at this point with this legislation?
The problem I'm having is that now that we know that what exactly is in the county code regarding this, and it's a code we've already adopted, a lot of what I have here is duplicate. Okay. That's never good, because if there's a word different here or there, people interpret it differently. I don't want any of that. So I'm going to, I think Alderwoman Tierney and perhaps Alderman Schandelmeyer will have helped actually in paring down what we actually need in here. And the obvious thing we need is to allow Annapolis Police Department to write citations and respond to calls like this. I mean, you saw what happened in my ward. I shared it with everybody just a couple of weeks ago. Now, I don't know that anybody would have been able to prevent the dog from dying, being attacked and being killed. But you know, there's no citation, there's no nothing, there's no consequence to the owner for that type of thing. And I think knowing that you can call the police and they'll usually respond quickly. I mean, obviously, if they're on another call, this isn't going to be, you know, the #1 priority call, but most of the time they'll be able to respond quickly. And the presence of a police officer is, I think in and of itself is pretty good to have when these things happen. You know, we've got all of the playing fields. I forget the name of it, the Bush Recreation Center or something, all the fields behind Germantown and the Phoenix Center and all of that. It's like in one open dog park, and people come over and take their dogs off leashes. They do it during games. I mean, we've had to stop a lacrosse game last year because a dog was chasing somebody with a ball running down the field. And
Alderman Payon.
Problems with that. And that's just an example. We also have Poplar Park, where everybody walks their dog, and for some reason they think because it's in a public park they don't need to leash their dog, and it's quite the opposite, actually.
Thank you, Alderman Payon. I'm afraid we have a hard stop at 6:15 because there is another meeting at 6:30, and Robin really needs to go because today's her son's birthday. So thank you, Robin, for waiting for us and sharing with us. And I'm sure we'll see you again when Alderman Payon brings his new legislation back to us. So thank you. And
absolutely. Thank you all.
Happy birthday for us.
You hear that? Happy birthday.
Robin.
I'm afraid all of us are due, I believe, at another meeting at 6:30. And in an effort to give Julian a few minutes between meetings, I'm afraid we're going to have to stop at this point. Alderman Payon, you're going to withdraw 048.
That's the game plan right now, unless somebody, convinces me otherwise. And nobody has yet. I don't think there ought to be duplicate legislation. So. Okay.
And we will postpone action or discussion on 051 and 046. I apologize to Alderwoman Tierney. I thought maybe we'd get to it.
That's okay. This was quite fascinating, so no worries there.
So, anything else for the good of the order?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that we adjourn.
Well, thank you. I wish you could. I'll take a motion from a committee member, though.
Move we adjourn since Ross is muted.
Second.
Thank you.
We are going to reschedule.
For everyone's participation. I'll have Takia see if she can find a date for us. Thank you, Alderman Gay, and everybody else for participating, all the directors.
We had already started. We already started looking, so I'll be in contact with you.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you all.
See you at the next meeting.
Yes.